Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Sound on? Yeah, now. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. If I could ask you to come take your seats. We're going to do the wrap-up panel that brings it all together with an awesome lineup of heavy hitters from the state and federal governments. I'm Ellen Hanak. I'm the director of the Water Policy Center. I just want to thank you for being here. Welcome personally from me, and thanks to those who are in the room, and thanks to those who are online. And that thanks for being online goes right now, first and foremost, to Assistant Secretary Mike Connor, who is head of Civil Works at the Army Corps of Engineers. Can you see him now? Yep. Hi, Mike. How are you? Mike, can you hear us? I'm not sure Mike can hear us. Let's see. Hi, Mike. Yes. Welcome. Okay, we're on. Welcome, Mike. Really great to have you here. Mike's, you're in Denver, right? Is that right?
I am in Denver, yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me good?
So Mike, as many of you know, Mike has worn many hats in Western water, including with Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation, and now at the Army Corps of Engineers. So we're going to mostly probably talk about his current, what's under his current hat, but we'll maybe get some insights from him from some of his other perspectives on Western water as well. And then here in person with me, I have to my left, Joaquin Esquivel. I always think Pledge of Allegiance, or Joaquin Esquivel, who is chair of the State Water Board, and over to Joaquin's left is Karla Nemeth, director of the California Department of Water Resources. So just delighted to have a chance to kind of do a wrap up with this great team of leaders on sort of what does this all mean, and you know, how are we making progress? How are we making progress toward thriving with less, and what do we still need to do? And so I want to start first with just sort of tying together, you know, the dry years and the wet years, and thinking about this issue of climate whiplash, you know, a term that Daniel Swain coined a few years ago that has really resonated with people because it's just what you see in the weather that we're experiencing, in the climate that we're experiencing, even not just wet years, dry years, but also, you know, a wet month, a super wet month, and then 3 really dry months, you know, that kind of thing. So with that context, maybe, Karla, I want to start with you. What are we, you know, what are you seeing in terms of progress that we're making, and what are some of the big gaps that we still need to tackle?
So, great question, and I want to start by just commending the earlier panelist. I was listening, really terrific dialogue, and very important because none of it gets done if we don't have good state, federal, local partnerships. There are big gaps, and I would say first, I think the Newsom administration's, you know, understanding and sort of conversation around the gaps are really part of our adapting to a hotter, drier future. That was a short document that the administration put out in August, and that does a couple of important things for me personally, especially having been in the water world for quite a while. And one is when we start to understand more fully what's happening, what are the conditions that are we're experiencing relative to weather whiplash, and what do we need to be doing about it. After 2021, it was pretty clear, you know, we missed some runoff efficiencies by a mile, and the decreasing importance of our observed hydrologic history and all that data, which is critical. If reality is not matching that, then we really do need to do something different. And so that led us to a path of understanding what we think the role of hotter temperatures is as its own water demand. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that report, it essentially sets out planning goals. If we are to have a drought in 2030 or if we are to have a drought in 2040, what can we expect relative to increasing temperatures as an increasing demand on surface water supplies? What that also shows is we have to be doing everything. And I think a lot of us have lived off of the all of the above strategy as a little way of conflict avoidance maybe for the last 15 years. But we really mean it. We actually need to do everything. We need to recycle. We need to achieve permanent water use efficiencies, both in our urban world, our agricultural communities are going to see a reduction of acreage planted, just given what's happening overall with California hydrology. And because you invest in recycled water or desalination or other things, it doesn't mean that we don't, as a state, need to continue to reduce water use in a permanent way to respond to this climate challenge. Parts of California are going to look different, but ultimately climate is going to drive so much of our thinking, and that has generated, I think, a lot of attention on gaps and how far we need to go, and even as important, what it's going to take to get there, relative to forecast improvements, relative to how quickly we can get projects in the ground, and this ever-present issue of affordability, which we're all going to need to tackle.
Thanks, Karla. Joaquin.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Join Karla in her thanks. It's been an honor to be able to be part of this morning's discussion and to be here on this set. What has been pretty incredible to see is just how much more data rich we currently are. And whether it's forecast-informed reservoir operations, whether it's the way the water boards is currently curtailing water rights, or the way that the state has been able to respond to communities without drinking water, all of that is around ultimately having the data to be better decision makers amongst us. And there's been incredible progress. But that data alone is not enough. It has to be turned into information. It has to be turned into better decision making. And I think that what we have seen a real progress on is the better incorporation of that at the local level, whether it's groundwater sustainability agencies really tackling their issues and their plans, or the ability to respond and incorporate better information like, say, water quality data, which is really helping fuel what is a discussion around groundwater recharge that puts communities and ultimately the health of our basins in the long term into perspective. I think the reality is that we are at a very much a generational moment where all this increased data, all this information and decision making amongst us is really critical, because we're going to have to be making a lot of decisions here in the next years really quickly. But we have to do so better than we did 50 years ago when our projects were first completed, which, state of the art as they were, here find themselves mismatched for the climate that we have. And so having this greater fidelity to reality, if you will, has been just incredible to see how quickly we've been able to come, given how much we've actually avoided it for a long time. And I say that, perhaps in the water rights side, where we are doing effective curtailments. There are storied moments here where there's resistance to those curtailments, but you look at the record these last year plus, year and a half of curtailments, and what we find are incredible compliance in the Russian River watershed, or even up in the Scott and the Shasta, or in the Delta. And I think it's because water right holders themselves, to Erin's point, are wanting these systems, are wanting to be better decision makers, are wanting to use their rights in ways that help support the resilience of us all. But we're going to need to continue to make sure we actually have these tools, and we depend on here, I know there's a governance discussion that continues to kind of bubble up. And I just remind us that at least when it comes to the Delta, we had that. The Delta Reform Act created the Delta Stewardship Council. We created new governance. And I think sometimes it's a matter of really understanding And here, again, this kind of like a 50-year lens, really, to some of these discussions, where I think of the Clean Water Act and us celebrating the 50-year anniversary of that, or 50 years of the Water Board. And what we have is incredible progress on what were 50 years ago, things now that we would not at all stand for. Sewage, raw sewage flowing in many of our streams, as we know, storied rivers on fire in Cuyahoga and back east. And I think that what we have then is really a history of being able to tackle those big issues. And yes, the Clean Water Act or the water boards or a water rights system weren't, or the contracts that negotiate the way we move water through the projects weren't done at a time when we knew as much as we know now. But now we do, and it's incumbent upon us all to say, well, how are we going to set this up for the next 50 years and do so in a way that creates that greater fidelity to reality. And so where I've seen the most progress is where communities have become serious about that, where we have tools and common decision support tools that actually help people do more, and we're going to have to see a lot more.
Thanks, Joaquin. So Mike, over to you. And I don't think you've been able to follow fully the two prior panels, so I just want to let you know that there was a fair amount of discussion around FIRO or FURO, we're not sure which is the way to pronounce it, forecast-informed reservoir operations. And I know, when people think about the Army Corps, they think about flood management, but more and more they're also talking about that. And one of the things that you've done since you've come into this new position is sort of explicitly talk with the Corps about how do we play a role in drought management too. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the drought flood actions that the Corps can do and is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ellen, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you and Joaquin and Karla, and we've all worked together in the past, and it's a welcome opportunity to be on the panel and then to continue to work with all of my friends and terrific water managers in California. So just as a threshold question, because you're in California, I think, I will just say, I think we're still dealing with the need for a reality check across the nation. So in California, I think we've got over that first step. Let's admit we have a problem with weather extremes, and this is, this is the reality that we're dealing with. And I think, from the Corps' perspective, we're looking at this, and I think really understanding that we have 20th century infrastructure, but we've got a 21st century climate, and they don't match up. We don't have the right infrastructure, nor do we have the right operational rules in place. So recognizing we have that problem, that we're in an era of these new extremes, and just my anecdote on that is just, I issued a drought resilience directive / strategy memo to the Corps to talk about all the ways that the Corps can help build drought resilience as a partner with other entities. I issued that on July 28th, and immediately following that, over the next 8 weeks, there were 6 1 in 1,000 year precipitation events across the continental U.S. There were more worldwide. One of those, of course, was in California in Death Valley situation. And then at the same time, during that same period, 2 hurricanes, Fiona and Ian, with record storm surges from Ian on the coast of Florida. We're talking, 12, 13-foot storm surges at the heart of the storm, at the hurricane where it came on shore in Florida. So these are extreme events that demonstrate the need to be better prepared. So our infrastructure is valuable, but our infrastructure needs to be updated. I'd say our infrastructure needs to be updated in most situations. I will put in a plug, given the action taken yesterday, saying in Klamath, that's an example where the infrastructure needs to be removed because the costs of it long exceeded any of the benefits associated with that. So, we're looking at a number of initiatives to redo flood control projects, to bring in multiple benefits associated with those flood control projects. A perfect example is all the work we're doing along Yolo Bypass, American River, with the state of California. I came out in March. No, not March. It was in June, and met with Wade, Karla, and Joaquin. And I thought I was coming out there to say, hey, let's get on the same page with respect to looking at these projects so that we not just do flood control, that we build in habitat restoration, that we build in, use of the floodplain so that we can recharge our alluvial aquifers, that we can get as many benefits as possible. And then I found out that it was already being done, that this was the plan that's in place, whether it's along the San Joaquin, whether it's along the Sacramento, whether it's along the American, but we're doing it and we need to do more of that. And we certainly need to do more of that across the country. Then getting to your point is we need to operate the infrastructure we have differently. Our rule curves are old. They've not been updated. Sometimes even if we want to update them, we're so, dialed into flood protection being such the primary purpose of any project that we don't want to deviate and even incrementally take on a little bit more risk. But I think with better forecasting tools, better real-time information, which is what FIRO is all about. How do we, get better forecasts? How do we actually monitor storms better so that we can manage better and save water, particularly in an arid environment exists in California? We need to do that. We've got 3 or 4 pilot projects in place, 3 in California. We completed one with Mendocino. We saw an increase in available water supply through that multi-year pilot project. We're now going on to Oroville and the Yuba Valley. And I think we'll see more of the same. And so that's going to have real value, because also from an economic standpoint, operating smarter using the scientific tools we have is a much cheaper source of water than some of the new infrastructure that we've got to invest in this new era.
Thanks, Mike. So, that raises this theme of kind of affordability and how to be as smart as we can with the dollars that we have. Right now, we are also in a moment in time where there is some extra bounty in terms of dollars from the federal government and from the state. We knew that was not going to be a permanent stream of that amount, but there is a chunk of change right now. And Mike, you were just at the White House celebrating the year anniversary of the bipartisan infrastructure bill as one of the important ways that the federal government is kicking in some serious funding right now for water related and climate related things across the nation. So I want to kind of have a chance to talk with you, Mike, and with Joaquin and Karla about how do we make the best use of this jumpstart that we've got, and what is it enabling us to do that we couldn't do as well before, and how do we what do you want to see us do to make the most of it? And maybe Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's the necessary question. I will start with a threshold plug, since I'm not talking to members of Congress directly and I can't be accused of lobbying. We got $17.1 billion, huge influx, a lot of needs that we're addressing along a number of the mission areas of the Corps of Engineers. But we've got a real backlog of $80+ billion, and we've got a Water Resources Development Act, legislation that's probably going to get enacted before the end of this year, and that's going to put another $40 billion worth of projects on our plate. And so the reality is, this is great. The president accomplished a great thing with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Those investments are necessary. I can just tell you from the Army Corps perspective, we've got more expectations and more complex studies and investigations ongoing because of these extremes and the needs that communities have and their desire to get in front of that. So that's my plug for more funding in the infrastructure area. We're not done just because we got Bill and Inflation Reduction Act. But I think, how do we move the dial? How do we make it meaningful? And I'll give you my example, which does go back to my prior history. Back in 2010, we started the Water Smart program, and the Water Smart program had, a whole new grant program, very focused on conservation, and it also had the Basin Studies program. And I remember being asked, well, how are these programs going to address the, there was a drought back then, and California had specific needs, and the Colorado River had specific needs and issues and risks. And, at the time, I basically just said, I don't know specifically. I just know if we do more conservation, we're going to have more flexibility. And hopefully we'll get going on the Water Smart Grants program, and then we will follow up with the Basin Studies program and put that overlay of strategic investment so that we're solving actual problems with a very focused, way of managing to the risk that we saw. And in some places we've done that. The Yakima Basin in Washington is a perfect example. I do think they have a very focused strategy to deal with water supply, water availability, environmental needs, and a whole array of ways that they know they're going to move the dial on drought resiliency. I think in the Colorado River Basin, we did that in some ways with the drought contingency plan. We said, here's the risk of Lake Mead and Lake Powell falling to critically low elevations, and here's the level of conservation we need to minimize that risk, to reduce that risk by 2 or 3-fold. It was a great plan, but going to Karla's point earlier, we missed the mark. We didn't have the right data. The risk was obviously much greater than we thought, and that's what's being experienced right now. So bottom line is, from a federal perspective, it's probably, and this is tough because a lot of federal agencies are grant agencies. We can't just have random acts of conservation or random acts of kindness. I think now to move the dial, we need to have a much more focused strategy that, deals with issues that help manage to specific risk, and we need better tools to assess that risk. And that's a planning level of initiative, and that's where the feds need the states. And in California, we have that. I mean, that gets back to the flood control projects and the array of benefits we're trying to do in California. We don't have that everywhere, and we don't have the partners, quite frankly, in some states that we do in California to put together those specific strategies. But I think that's much more focused in how we make our investments, and that's going to require a new way of doing business. And getting back to the point made earlier, partnerships are the key to making progress, but now partnerships are just an imperative to move the needle.
So maybe since California is more ready, maybe you can just send some more of that money to us. Going over to the state side a little, and Joaquin, you're kind of in a situation where you've got some state money to spend, but you also have some of the extra federal money that goes to the board to allocate. So a little bit again on sort of opportunities to really make a difference with this infusion.
Yeah, thank you. And Mike has it right. It's about being more intentional and the opportunity to have a little more intentionality out of programs. And we'll just say on the funding side, the state revolving funds, they were really emanated out of the late 80s, early 90s as a replacement to what was actually a huge historic investment in our water systems that actually brought us, and many communities haven't been touched since, but brought us the access to sanitation, brought us the access to drinking water that we all now, again, can easily take for granted. And so, when this, and then kind of retreated and really became a model of local communities either having the capital, the economies of scale to continue to invest, to maintain, to expand, to address new contaminants coming up, climate change, aging infrastructure or not. And so we're at a point now where and those programs, I'll say, in the late 80s and 90s, the SRFs, they were not uncomplicated to engage in. And the fact that we have nearly 3,000 community water systems in the state of California, I mean, we have a lot of great well-capacitated, larger urban water systems that can navigate those programs and those that can't. And so, I think what our real opportunity here on the funding side is to be more intentional, but to have that greater alignment, which is pretty incredible, between the state and the federal government on this generational opportunity to make sure that these dollars go as far as they possibly can right now, because, as was discussed earlier, the deficits we're beginning to see mean that this tranche that we have, and it's starting to move through, really has to get us as much as we possibly can. And I think that, again, going to these inequity gaps, that is front of mind, I know, for the federal government and for the state as we try to expend these dollars and address that challenge, let alone the climate, the changed climate we now have, and the investments it means that folks in Los Angeles and again, these still larger, well-heeled, if you will, capacitated agencies are still needing that subsidy, still as well need dollars in order to maintain affordability for their larger service areas. And so at the state board, I'll just note that it's been interesting. Certainly we're here this year celebrating 10 years of the human right to water in the state of California, and actually have a lot of progress to show for it. But we still have a lot of communities, and as Kyle said, are a little more complicated sometimes, or we're needing to get out of the way and have faster processes. But we're trying to focus on all that so that we can ensure we get the dollars out, but it comes fundamentally down to the local level where that decision making is happening, where applications then actually emanate to the state or federal government. And how do we support the decision making in the right vision, if you will, for this collective work we're all doing these next years to invest, to understand our challenges, and to try to, again, put ourselves on the right path. I think we have a huge opportunity. The bipartisan infrastructure law allows that. We have programs already in place now that can be, again, further scaled and receive investment. But I'm concerned that this moment of sort of truly, again, we haven't seen these numbers since the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act were passed from the federal government for support of what are our most fundamental systems, for all the support that energy, transportation, these key things that support interstate commerce receive insofar as the federal government. We've been needing and need a long-term support from the feds. Is that an affordability program? Hopefully, we'll see. But I think at the least, when it comes to these infrastructure dollars, we know that they contribute to affordability. We have to get them to the communities that need it most. And importantly, we need to support the ability for those projects to come to us to begin with to be funded.
Karla, DWR has been doing a lot of new stuff.
We have been doing a lot of new things. One, I would say the department has gotten out more funding more quickly than I've ever seen, really, in the past year and a half, just looking at our grant programs. And I think that's indicative of all the good work that's also going on at the local level. People are really ready to go with their projects. But we will have put out $1 billion in probably a 24-month period through these kind of rolling grant programs. So that's huge, and that's out there, and it's essential. I also think, and Mike picked up on this as well, we're also at a moment where it's like everything everywhere all at once. We're like in this multiverse, where at the department, we're right now revamping our State Water Project Delivery Capability Report to account for climate change, multiple different scenarios. All of our contractors need to be aware of not just the state's thinking on that, but how it works with their own local water supply portfolios. That in and of itself will drive certain approaches to groundwater management, particularly in the Central Valley where we have these critically overdrafted groundwater basins. The department is also in the middle of analyzing the climate work that did or did not happen in the groundwater management plans. We're taking a look at our own guidelines for how we expect groundwater sustainability agencies to address this weather whiplash. We'll have those out in about 18 months. So you kind of get a flavor of, everything is moving. We're also, at this moment, fairly dramatically expanding some of our forecasting. We heard a little bit about forecast-informed reservoir operations, but also this aerial snow observations that have now, last year was expanded into the Feather watershed. This year it's expanding into the Shasta watershed. So, you know, a lot of information coming in all together, and then how we integrate that at the department across programs so that everyone is looking at a future and the way that we think about risk in the future to make better decisions about how we invest in infrastructure, how we reoperate existing infrastructure, but how we invest in new infrastructure, and you know, how we get rid of the old. So I'm glad that you mentioned it, Mike. You know, Klamath, huge deal yesterday. I think it's really exciting that here in California we can be working through a Delta conveyance project, a big piece of new infrastructure that we think we need for climate adaptation, while we are also simultaneously decades long. A lot of folks have been working on that Klamath project for a good chunk of their careers. So it is just a tremendous moment to have that license surrendered and to really start that process. But we can't be afraid of thinking big, taking out big infrastructure, putting in big infrastructure that we think is going to help our system work better. But an underpinning of all of that is how we think about planning into the future and how climate is expressing itself. And I think that really forces us to have much better dialogue about uncertainty, because we're so comfortable with our, 82-year hydrology, and, science is about observed data. And so now we start looking at, well, what's the past 30 years? And what's the past 15 to 10 years? What is that telling us? And so as we transition to something that looks different, we're not going to have all the observed data that we're typically comfortable with. Some of it still holds, some of it's not holding. So it feels like, well, we got to do this yesterday, but what it really requires is just increased improvements in dialogue at the state, federal, local level with folks in the environmental community about, what do we see coming from these swings? What do we see about risk, and where are our best opportunities to really handle risk? And that is hugely important as it relates to species and our investments in habitat restoration. We're doing some really interesting things this year with some pilot projects, getting fish to the McCloud. How do we kind of seed these little opportunities and really nurture the partnerships that are required to make that happen? So that's happening in the McCloud. We've got this great work, I think, happening with the Rice Commission. It is happening. I think it's great. In the Sac Valley, we're doing, I think, interesting things in the Delta, not just on conservation, but just a genuine reach out to landowners and acknowledging that the system works different in the Delta. We can't have a cheat sheet about if you do X, Y, and Z, it's going to generate, this kind of conservation savings. We have variability in California. We need to sort of honor that and develop programs that can support that and get at that issue. And then, as I think Sandy mentioned earlier, Sandy Matsumoto, the great thing is that program is now expanding to think about, birds and how we do that. So there's all these little things. And then actually one more little thing that I think holds a lot of promise is both the department and the water board supported national, I'm going to mess it up, but it's with the Department of Energy, National Alliance for Water Innovation, and we're very focused together on how to deal with energy issues, particularly with brackish water desal. And so that's going to help us with new tools, and there's some really promising things. Turns out you get a hub in California and you get to kind of move in some California problems and say, help us in Allensworth in the Central Valley, help us in Cambria, help figure out some areas where we just haven't been able to crack the code with consolidation or other kinds of things. And those are pretty exciting results that are starting to emerge that I think can help us with some of our most pressing challenges.
Thanks. So this is exciting, and it sounds like, the message I'm hearing from all of you is to spend the money smartly. We got to really be pretty intentional, put a lot of heads together, and leverage some of the new tools that we've got to think about about risk, and yeah, I'm thinking back to Thad's comment in the first panel about how, ultimately, when we're talking about money, we're talking about trade-offs, because we don't have enough to spend it everywhere. So where to really put the effort to get the most out of it. So, okay, so now I want to pivot before we go to audience questions, just a little bit to I'll say what used to be a third rail, California Water, which was talking about, the water rights system and whether we need to tinker with how we administer it in light of the changing climate. And I'm going to throw in there water rights and also contracts, because so much of the water that gets used in California is actually by folks who have contracts with the state or the federal projects. And there's a lot of discussion about that this year. There was a white paper that Planning Conservation League coordinated and released back in February with a number of eminent folks participating in that. But it's also just been kind of part of the discussion and thinking as we think both about the dry times and about the wet times. And in the dry times, it's a question of, if you don't have enough to go around, how do you manage that? Do you just kind of let it, let it fall apart on itself, or do you implement the water rights system with curtailments and such? And then in the wet times, how do you make sure that we're not missing opportunities to sock away extra water from storms that wouldn't otherwise get used? So maybe Joaquin, start with you. You all are in charge of the curtailment program, and it definitely it's had some bumps in the road over. We didn't actually have to have curtailments for decades until the last major drought, and then right. And now you've had within a short space of time had to grapple with that with a couple droughts. Just some thoughts on what we still need to fix.
Yeah, I think what we first need to do is actually administer the water rights system. And I think to your question, do you allow our communities to just, go it their own, figure it out, or implement the water rights system? I think the answer is you implement the water rights system. It's why it's there. It's what we need to do. And we have not done so for the entire history of the state of California. But it's not unlike the discussion around groundwater management as well, where for a while it kind of worked that way. It allowed, the system had enough kind of, fluff in there that, there's peace in the valley, people were able to maintain. But given a drier climate, given now the reality that we have a lot, and we know we have a lot more rights on the books than actually are exercised or that can be supported, we have to actually get serious about this very fundamental fidelity with reality, if you will, that we need to get right, because it supports everything else that we do. And that's how we extract water from the system, from our state, and how importantly we do so in a way that is actually supported by what is there. And so you look at any other Western state, and by matter, of course, they curtail far more often. And importantly, to curtail, there's a couple of things you need. You need to know what's actually in the watershed, so what's hydrologically available, how much could you actually pull from the system. And you need to know then who has priority and claim to right as you then try to curtail a priority system. And importantly, the third leg, if you will, of that stool is what do you need to leave enough in the system so that you don't extirpate all your species and or disconnect important systems. And so including ones that support drinking water for the entire state. And so we don't, and we haven't adjudicated our water rights like other Western states have been doing diligently for the last decades, so that we can answer this question when it comes time to curtail. And so we're behind. And it isn't even a matter of reform or being the boogeyman of change in water rights. It's being serious and honest, as Bill, I think, really was, with what is actually being faced on the hydrology side, and then how do we accomplish not just allowing our communities to go completely dry. And I think what is exciting, though, is that you look at the evolution these last years of water rights administration in the state of California, and where, in 14-15, the height of the last drought, the water board issued, notices of water unavailability and try to enforce those. That recently by the courts was, now very much less of a path. But what we've done different this time around is we developed a methodology. We used our unreasonable use authorities to ensure that, it's legally sound. But importantly, we incorporated and we brought in water right holders to say, hey, we need to curtail. How do we do so best? Knowing that we haven't done that critical part of our homework, the adjudication of our watersheds, so we don't have an exact accounting and know exactly everyone in priority, but we have your demand data. We finally, in 2018, made it so that yearly, all water right holders actually have to report that, and we're able to use it. To again, you look at the Russian River watershed, the success on just the implementation of the curtailments has been because the community themselves was ready for this. And I think that here in the next years, we're going to have to be doing a lot more of this, administering the water rights system, but importantly, adjudicating out basins, understanding who can prove up to what. And unfortunately, that's going to take decades, if we're being honest, because of the due process afforded water right holders and all of that, which we need to have. So the question becomes, what do we do until then? And how do we still administer water rights, respect water rights, and do so in an era where we know that we're really behind in our homework, and there must be ways for us to administer rights, even absent that. And the state of California and the Water Board has shown that we can do that these last years in the watersheds that we've been infecting curtailment.
Thanks, Joaquin. So I want us to get to questions in just a few minutes, but just if we could, Karla and Mike, if you want to, I don't want to get you fired from your current job, so if you want to weigh on this too, you're welcome. But just the issue that kind of came up in the first panel, where Thad, who's represents a settlement contractor for the CVP, they've got enshrined in their contract that they're going to get at least 75% of their water, and the state water project also has some folks who have pretty solid contracts. The water's just not there. Wasn't there to meet that. So there were some, negotiations around how to solve that. But sort of looking ahead, how do we anticipate and deal with that in a good way?
Yeah. So, Mike, do you want to try this, or do you want? I can go first.
I'll let you go first, and I'll follow up.
Okay. First and last. I think that is the issue that's staring us in the face. And so, for Department of Water Resources, we have our own settlement contractors on the Feather River. And how we've been managing, even since the previous drought, is a lot of informal, well, the water's not there, how do we want to do this year? I think what's really staring us in the face is that drought wasn't that long ago, and here we are having the same conversations. And at some point, that degree of uncertainty doesn't work for anybody. And so I think that, into the future, for DWR, taking a look at that contract and really working with our settlement contractors and challenging ourselves to think about what does that sort of senior position, look like in the context of climate change and longer duration droughts, bigger, more intense events. And I think, that's where, with the department moving forward with an update for its delivery capability report, that information's that information, and we're going to have to use all that kind of data to have a conversation further upstream about, what do we think about that? What is the expression of seniority and reliability in the context of climate? When the Oroville facility was first in, I think, a big part of it was how do we provide more predictability to these folks with these senior rights in the system. Over time, that's provided over 1 million acre feet of just water supply because we were able to sort it out and able to introduce this kind of reliability into a system that for them also wasn't as reliable as it could be. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think we can't put our head in the sand because it's happening around us now, and we'll be faced with immediate circumstance if this year is dry. We have reduced our feather settlement folks twice in the last 2 years by 50%. The contract is, very clear that we weren't contemplating these much deeper droughts. So according to the contract, you can't reduce at all for the next 5 years. And so, it's a pretty stark example of, just a way of thinking about it that's not up to the challenge of longer, deeper droughts. And so we're going to have to start engaging in those discussions.
Thanks, Karla. Mike, a couple thoughts on this?
Couple quick thoughts. I'd say that it is somewhat wonderful to be in the Army Corps world where I don't really worry about a whole lot of contracts as much and water supply as much as I worry about water availability. And that gets into forecast informed reservoir operations, gets into deviations, how we release flood waters and allow water rights holders to pick up that water. That's our goal, to increase water availability. That's a lot of what that drought resilience strategy is about. But I will just quickly opine, going back to my reclamation days. I think it's great. Joaquin is talking about, curtailments and the State Water Board's responsibility in this area to manage water. Karla has identified, I think, what reclamation does. We have these contracts and we have curtailed under the contract terms for many, many years now, given the lack of water and who's the priority in the contract world has played out to a certain degree. So I just mentioned having the regulatory side of things, having the contracts, and then having the ability to make investments to minimize risk. And I think that's what's changed over the last decade, is whether they're the Sacramento River settlement contractors, exchange contractors, whoever they all have risk now. It's not the ability to sit back and say, I'm the senior water rights holder. Everybody's at risk with respect to the extreme nature of the drought. And so, we made settlement agreements. We made different agreements when we came in and built these large reservoir facilities. If we come back and make significant public investments in conservation strategies, new infrastructure that helps us move water, what agreements can we make with all these parties that, let's face it, whether it's Colorado River or the Central Valley, we're making agreements that kind of circumvent the pure priority system because of the risk people see, whether it's regulatory, whether it's just pure hydrology, and we need to continue to do that.
Great, thank you. So, okay, we have some, now I can see you. Questions, raise your hand if you have questions for these fine folks. Here we go. And please say who you are. Okay. Oh,
sorry,
Pablo.
You're in the room now. I have another
now.
question, sorry. It's Pablo Garza with the Assembly Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. And Ellen, thanks for teeing up kind of the water rights issue. And Joaquin, I appreciate what you said. And I think you're right, coming to grips with reality. And I like that phrase, fidelity to reality. I think that's important. But when I think of our current water rights system and administration of it, I don't know that I would say fidelity to reality just yet. And I think you've outlined a lot of improvements and successes that are very worthy in getting us there. But I guess the question is, the governor's strategy says, in August, says modernizing water rights. And so can you give us more insight into what you guys are thinking there?
Thank you, Pablo. I appreciate that. So one, we have a $30 million investment in our Upwards project, which is our water rights database system. And I know it's hard to get excited about a system, but this is a systems discussion, and I know, but this is a systems discussion. And again, the administration of water rights is so fundamental to all of these activities, all of this decision making, that we deserve a 21st century decision-making space for water rights. And so that's a huge focus. We're in the middle of selecting a vendor. We next year are going to be gunning on that project, and we hope by 2024 we're actually going to have some viable product out there that is actually starting to be phased in. And I won't promise too much because we still have a lot to go. But what we've been able to do is actually take advantage of procurement advances with CDT and GovOps that were used for things like COVID response to really say this is an emergency, this is really critical. The fact that the state of California has an eRIMS database system that's well over 20 years old is a legacy system and needs to be updated so that we can be better decision makers in this space is huge. So that's a huge priority right now, as well are actually using the resources that the governor and the legislature have provided us for enforcement, for additional staff. And to your point though, we're gonna need more. This is a down payment, certainly, but what it will do is really start to drive and advance a lot of discussions that curtailment have already really kicked off. There, I think of the Russian River watershed, I think of the voluntary sharing agreement on the upper watershed that came together, where again, I think water right holders themselves want these systems, want to express their rights in ways that let them contribute to critical projects in their communities, but importantly, let everyone know that there is, again, some fidelity so that we are all better accounting for and aligning ourselves for what we have. And so it's on enforcement. It's on also as well, we received some resources in this last budget cycle to telemeter out a couple of watersheds potentially, but at least one to really go ahead and test drive. What does a 21st century water rights administration system look like? How do you telemeter out or have the data enough to be able to have real-time administration of it? And how do you bring people along? And importantly, not just talk at the theoretical level here at the state, but really just work in a community and show and have some confidence building in the water rights space that we can be doing a lot more. So we're looking to maximize those resources. We're looking to continue to understand even in the in-year variability has been great to see adjustment toward, where as we're administering rights, we're mindful that we need to store water. We're looking at the latest forecasts and getting to a more real-time system. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks. How about anybody else? I see a hand back here.
Okay. Hi, I'm Amy Merrill with American Rivers.
Hi, Amy.
And thank you so much. This has been a learning experience for me. Just on the data nerd question, I'm excited that you're wanting to move into that and having, more data that's available to implement the water rights. And I just am wondering, maybe you've already thought of this, I'm sure you have. Are you thinking about cross-collaborating and the openness of that data so that, working with DWR and the universities and Scripps and, sharing models and a common understanding of our fidelity to reality?
Yes. The partnership with DWR and the rest of the state and all of our work is critical. All of the curtailment data we have is all open data. Our methodologies on the curtailment as well, all there meant to be replicable and importantly for everyone to help better contribute to. And especially as we go to implement the Upwards project, are going to be reaching out even more because that's where the rubber will hit the road and having a system that has a back end, an advanced programming interface, an API, whether it's JSON or other things, to really be able to quickly mine the information from the water rights system and repurpose it for academic purposes, for a local project, for information that is outside of even what we need for our decision-making space is really what's really critical and powerful. I say on the open side as well, we're using OpenET, which is an openly developed platform where Delta water users themselves are in the middle of developing an alternative compliance plan for water use reporting, where they are here themselves training on how to understand and use the OpenET platform to be able to have a low-cost reporting option to the board, and that may be replicable in other places in the state where you may not have metered yet. It's maybe a little costly, but there may be a lower-cost option, open source tool that we're looking to use and that can help make others be better decision makers too.
We don't have a lot of time left. Sarah, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, I've got a question from Kate Haldeman of Sustainable Conservation. She's asking, what are the biggest policy or other barriers to realizing significant additional water storage during wet years? And who needs to come together to create solutions to those barriers?
Okay, that is a great one for us to wrap up on because we get back to the wet, and I would love it if each of you could kind of use that question as a sort of, as your closing salvo. So quick priorities for storing water better.
Well, right now we're working on permits to get recharge projects functional by December. We learned our lesson from last year, which is it would have been really helpful to have projects ready to go to capture when it is going to come. So there's a lot of work underway under the auspices of the governor's executive order between the Department of Water Resources and the Water Board to establish criteria and issue temporary permits, and then do an assessment about what's working and not working. I would say as a general matter, I like this approach because we have to start learning from doing, and we have to give ourselves permission to not do it perfectly so that we can learn and fine tune as we go. So particularly for underground storage, I think that's a key feature, is to test out these various kinds of pilot scale recharge projects. I think the other key piece that we need to do is complete our mapping statewide. So the Department of Water Resources has completed, it's a flyover, and we measure the electromagnetic resistance about 1,000 feet underground so we can understand soil types and the best opportunities for recharge. And that work, we're now processing. It takes us about 18 months after we do those flights to really process that information. So hopefully over the course of the next several months, we'll be ready to go with that kind of mapping in our most critically overdrafted groundwater basins. That's going to be crucial piece of information so that we can work more broadly with all of these efforts that are underway in the valley. I think its name's changed, but the Uncommon Dialogue program, for example, which is really thinking more kind of at scale. I do think we have a gap in governance as it relates to groundwater management. One of the ways in which plans did struggle was when we could not get coordinating agreements. So the law allows, for a lot of subdivision approaches to groundwater management, and I think we're really missing that kind of regional governance. And so I think those couple of things are my priorities as we move through, what's the quickest way we can, when we've got these big rain events, get it into storage as quickly as possible. And then it's not quick, but I do have to say, I did want to raise my hand from the roundtables in the previous panel. The Delta Conveyance Project is an enormously important project for climate adaptation. It's a different project. In very significant ways, its physical attributes and the work that's been done. And my view, particularly when we look at last year, where it's possible to have record-breaking rain and snow events in a month of a year that continues to be exceptionally dry. And if we're not able to move that water, it is going to create a follow-on and deeply challenging effects throughout California. If you're moving towards recycled water, you still need to have more predictability, even if it's less, more predictability about what's coming in, and that project is just crucial to moving stormwater and saving it.
Thanks. I hope Kathleen is still in the room to hear you. So Mike and Joaquin, you just have 30 seconds each. What's your top priority for storage, for improving storage?
To look at all the available options, whether they're, and that means permittable options, regulating reservoirs. I don't think, small reservoirs, I think have a lot of capability. The aquifer storage aspect, and how do we use our existing reservoirs better to store more water, which gets into FIRO and other things. And then let's just remember, restoring hydrologic function wherever we can, how often we can, always adds to water availability by keeping it in the system rather than, for Army Corps, channeling it as quickly as we can somewhere where it can't be used.
Great. And Joaquin?
I'll plus up Karla's request. Right now is the time to be getting in temporary permits for groundwater recharge. It's not to wait a week before you see a storm and you really want to get your permit through. It does take time for us to do our work. Now's the time to be getting those in. I'll plug that in because we do want to take advantage of any storms that we may see. Just think of last year again. There are just these moments, and we need to be best prepared for them. And you do that not in the moment, but before. And that extends to drinking water. I'll just say that what's front of mind is just what we'll be seeing next summer, given the pressures on the Colorado, given the ongoing pressures of this drought, really understanding how we as a state and the feds support our communities and ensure we don't go without is just really front of mind.
Okay, well, thank you, and please join me, everybody, here in the room and at home in thanking this wonderful panel. And I think Mike has to say goodbye right away and go to the airport, right? Thank you so much, Mike, for taking time.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye. So all of you now, you are invited to stand up, stretch your legs, and grab some yummy food. And we don't have a formal program now. It's just mingle time and network time and a chance to really enjoy being in 3D together. So thanks so much to all of you in the audience. Thanks so much to all of the awesome panelists, and thanks so much to the PPIC team that pulled this together, including our awesome events team and Jerica Miles, our center administrator. Special shout outs to them. Thank you.